Hello, my name is Desmond Lynch. I'm 23 years old and I want to be a filmmaker. I recently made a short film and I would like to tell you how I made it. The film is called The Edit. It's about a man who sets out on editing a video project, but as he does so, he experiences a lot of difficulty with the monotony of the task and the pressure that comes with completing such a task. I made the film for a few reasons. First is that I'm trying to keep busy, productive. If anything, to get off the sofa and actually do something productive, it's a step forward for me. The second, I like making things. I made a podcast called The Witch in the Orchard, I'm making it, that's for sure, but I'm still in post and I've been procrastinating editing it for some time. For The Orchard, I put in a lot of time and effort for pre-production. I wrote scripts, held auditions, went location scouting for recording studios, booked actors, hired out studio space, spent an obscene amount of money producing the actual thing, and now we're in post a few months later and it's just there. Keep in mind there's 3 episodes total. Each episode possesses an average of 8 hours worth of audio recordings from production, which I edited down to 45 minutes per episode. On top of that, I had to fix the technical issues, find music, sound effects, fix the pacing and narrative issues. It's quite a lot to handle and it's taken quite some time to get it to what I deem acceptable quality. I've been at it so long that I got sick of it, so I decided to busy myself with other things till I returned to it. I made some sound edits with the help of some actors who had sent me monologues, poems, and other things I could use. I wrote a screenplay and I wrote half of another one. Then I decided to make a short film based on the stress I felt editing the podcast. That short film is called Monotony. It's currently still in pre-production and will likely end up being 20 or so minutes long, but before I could make that movie, I wanted to see if it could actually work. So I decided to make this film, The Edit. The main issue I had with the film as a whole was how I could make something as dull and monotonous as editing interesting to watch. Watching an editor work is like watching paint dry, but more depressing. I went about production not as I usually would. I not only committed the cardinal sin that every film student has done by not making or using a storyboard or shot list, I didn't even bother writing up a script. I just shot something on the day at a certain time, hoped it looked pretty, hoped it would be useful in the edit. I did that for a few hours a day, every day for a week, and that was pretty much production wrapped. The film itself is cheap as hell, made the entire thing in my flat, majority of it in the living room alone. It was intentional because 1, there's a lot of free space, 2, it's a main location in the house and will be featured a lot in the film Monotony. I wanted to see how many different ways you could film one location, and there were difficulties, but I did my best to overcome them. Gear-wise, it was pretty simple. I used the Canon EOS 1300D to film with. It's primarily a photo camera, but I got some decent footage out of it. Lenses, I used a 50mm EF lens and an 18 to 135mm zoom lens. They're complete polar opposites from each other. Most of the stuff I shot on the 18 to 135, but I'd occasionally shoot on the 50mm. I felt it was good for getting certain kinds of close-ups, gets real interesting perspective that I liked for some of the shots. The tripod I used was pretty basic. It's a Neewer SAB 264. It's a bit old, worn down, but holds the camera still, and that's all I needed for it. Because it was just me filming everything, all the shots are stationary. Only movement from any shot is from my hand shaking while holding the camera for certain shots. Outside of that, everything is still, framed how I liked it. None of that would have mattered, of course, if I didn't have the proper light setup. I used a pack of dimmable bi-color LED lights I got from Neewer. 480 LED lights, got them for a pretty decent price, and they make a big difference. I used them alongside some homemade color filters I used to change up the light colors, and some softboxes I bought online. Softboxers are good to make the light look less harsh, especially on the skin. Also spreads the light out farther too. That's the majority of the gear I used on production. I didn't record any sound during filming, decided as there was no dialogue I wanted to see if I could make it with all Foley. I'll get into that later. I'd done some pre-production work before filming. I gathered up some references from photos and other things like that to figure out what I wanted the film to look like. The big focus was the use of light and shadow. The picture quality, I wanted to use as much light as possible. That way in post I don't have to worry about grainy footage and can then accentuate shadows and make it darker in the edit. I've had problems in the past with grainy footage due to low light filming, and I wanted to avoid that. The setup was pretty simple. I often used only 1 or 2 LEDs. I used a white light and an orange filter light at the beginning of the film, adding this evening vibe and implying the lights are on. Actual room lights were never used as they just looked unpleasant, so LEDs were used. I tried my best to follow Roger Deakins' outlook on cinematography and lighting. It's not enough for a shot to look pretty, it has to make sense. You have to ask yourself, where's the light coming from? Is it coming from a lamp? Is it a light bulb? A phone? It has to come from somewhere to help with the immersion. That's how I approached it. One of the main light sources for the film was the computer itself. However, the computer screen was nowhere near bright enough. I ended up using the light from my phone, sometimes two phones, to get that harsh white light on the face. You can see the difference between one and two phones with how the shadows reflect on the wall. Use of light helps show passes of time as well. At the start we have two lights, one white one orange, getting this bleak, murky evening vibe. As evening goes into night, we take out the orange light, replace it entirely with the white LED and the phone. Near the end of the night, the only light source is coming from the phone or screen itself. Kind of like the only way you can see is because of the screen. It's taking up everything in the character's life. Near the end, he's in complete darkness and then natural light. I actually filmed that near noon. Get that natural, harsh, bright light. It's a total contrast from the rest of the film. Very surreal, and anyone who's done an all-nighter can know like daylight after staying up all night can be very harsh and unappealing and like just not pleasant. The space I filmed in was pretty sparse set design-wise. I made the sofa look prettier by adding a blue duvet to contrast to red. I added a few pillows as well to fit the screen. I tried to frame most of the film so there's not a lot of dead space, not a lot of focus on the blank white walls unless there's shadows being cast off them. Shadows actually were a big help in many scenes to make the room look more interesting. It's just me shooting this thing, so I had no proper stand-in. I ended up just using one of the spare LED stands to use the stand-in so I could focus on it manually. I didn't have a shot list or storyboard, so I was kind of going with my gut for most production. I ended up getting the same types of shots in different lighting setups. In the edit, I tried not to use repetitive framing, but the way you should approach production is you want more than you need, so you might as well get it if you can. There's no sound recording during production. The camera itself has an inbuilt microphone, but it's no good for media stuff. You need an independent audio recording device, and I felt for this project I could do all the sound in post. What I ended up doing was finding most of the sound online via sound libraries and other places like that. Found everything from ambient room tone, just the sound of a still room, to Foley stuff like footsteps, door opening, creaking of floorboards, etc. Even little stuff like the ruffling of clothes. You'd only notice that if it's not there, but when it is there, it makes the whole thing seem a lot more real. I ended up recording some Foley myself, spent an entire evening getting sound effects around the house. Became very handy, especially for ambience in the kitchen. I quickly became aware that visuals weren't enough to establish the tone of this film. A lot of it is driven by the sound, so the sound design of the film ended up being a lot more complicated than I thought. I really hate editing, which you can tell by the fact that I just made a movie to establish how much I hate editing. Honestly, as a career, I'd rather write or produce or direct, but if you gave me a computer and asked me to mix it all together, I'm just gonna start pulling my hair out. The Witch in the Orchard would take an entire day just to get 2 minutes of a scene exactly how I wanted it to sound. 45 minutes per episode, 3 episodes, that's a lot of work. That's a lot of days, and I work and I do other stuff on top of that, so you can imagine how stressful it can be. You compare that to a sound edit, I can get one of those wrapped up in less than 3 hours. You can check some of those out on my Spotify. With the short film, it only took me about a week to edit it. That includes figuring out what shots I wanted to use, getting them into the order I wanted, mixing the sound of the footage, changing the colors of the footage, and adding special stuff like adjusting the frame in post, or adding stuff like text or titles or stuff and credits and all that stuff. So there's a lot going on. I tried my best to avoid using repetitive shots. Most shots I used was like up to 3 or 4 times. A shot like the one of me typing on the keyboard I used near 10, but that's because it was the best and the only shot I had of me typing of that light setup. The dilemma with shooting was how I can make the editing process watchable. So in the edit I relied a lot on like a diverse range of footage, all pretty short in length to keep up the momentum. Cut out a lot of monotony and replace it with stuff that kind of looks pretty, that makes it a lot more visually compelling. Sound proved invaluable. There's almost never a moment's silence. There's always something going on, whether it be a couple arguing in the other room or sound effects coming from the edit itself. I really went ham and included a bunch of weird sound effects. Cars, traffic, people crying, dogs barking, a riot at one point. A bunch of weird, crazy stuff all mixed together to get this weird bombardment of noise. On top of that, you had other stuff as well. I included like various drones throughout. Namely, when the bus driving sound effect came on, I wanted to build a sense of unease, so I included a few drone tracks in the background. Just an annoying faint buzz that irks the soul. Scenes like the tea pour scenes, I ended up adding their own special drone effect as well to make it like special and unique. So anyone who's ever done an all-nighter knows that caffeine's essential. I've had a few projects I edited driven entirely by tea or coffee, ended up having caffeine overdose a few times. The sheer amount of stuff I was drinking, so in the beginning the tea pouring isn't as bad. Later on the sound is pouring has been amplified by like 10 decibels. On top of that, you have a different drone track that it plays exclusively in those scenes to add its own intense kind of toxic vibe to it. It's very unpleasant, and that's why I think it works. Music-wise, there's only a few things going on. You have Nocieni #1 playing, of course. It's like the color grey of classical music. Kind of like really establishes the monotony of it all and the mundanity at the beginning of it. You have this obnoxious club music playing at some point, meant to establish a house party happening outside the flat, which the editor is trying to ignore. That's royalty-free music I got from Devo.com. It served its purpose. It's pretty decent. Then in the end you have this cool somber saxophone jazz track, a bit of royalty-free music I found online. Initially, for the release of Tension, I wanted to include a song from this punk band out in America called Def. I really like their music, they're very indie, very cool. I've been listening to them for years and I kept thinking one of their songs would be perfect for the scene. So I reached out to them to ask for permission for the song. They actually got back to me with a permission request form, but by that point I had already changed my mind and decided to use the saxophone jazz track. Yeah, the saxophone track just had that like tired, sad, somber vibe to it, like real 4 a.m. and you can't sleep energy to it, which I've experienced quite a lot and I thought was good for the scene. The night is a very depressing and lonely time after all. I ended up using that for this cool down sequence, mixed it together. Near the end I wanted to cut out most sound. Most of what you hear is just ambient sound of seagulls, which is very annoying in the morning. You mix that along with the Foley and rim tone. I was a little afraid of silence in the film. I always wanted to fill the void with something, but I thought some scenes needed to be quiet. That said, the loud scenes are some of my favourite ones. Nearing the end of production, I ended up showing the second and third draft to some colleagues I had gone to university with. Their editors themselves, but unlike me, they actually like it for some reason. But they gave me some pointers, and I took their advice. I ended up doing some reshoots, namely getting different shots of the cup pour scene to make it less repetitive. I made some things longer, made some things shorter. I adjusted the color of the film to make it look more consistent. Color-wise, I wanted it to look bleak, cold. I wanted to accentuate the blues and the oranges, make the evening scenes look a bit more murky and gross. I wanted to make the white light from the laptop a lot harsher. Blues and accentuating the shadows helped to make things look darker, more bleak, exactly the vibe I was going with. At the end of it, I was pretty happy with how it looked visually. Sound-wise, I was a little bit more worried. I worried Foley would sound out of place or fake, but to those who viewed the project, they said they didn't notice. I myself am only really aware of the sound itself because I mixed it. I know how it sounded in real life, and in the edit there are limitations. There's only so much you can do to replicate sound you didn't record on site on the day. That said, I'm happy enough with how post went. I'm still working on pre-production for Monotony. Probably going to get back to post-production on the podcast as soon as I begin production on Monotony. There's a lot to do. As for this current film, I have submitted it to several film festivals. It's early days, but I'm hoping for the best. But nevertheless, I'm glad I made this thing. It's not perfect, but if you compare where I was 3 or 4 years ago with where I am now, it's a big improvement, and I'm only going to get better. You can always get better. Thanks for watching.